So I've
Um,
started screen sharing, and you all should see the website Prices and Wages by Decade. Hopefully you see that. All right. So I want to tell you this website. I started it up 12 years ago just for fun. I mean, I literally just wanted to do something. I was always interested in this topic. I knew that back when I used to work at the State Historical Society of Missouri, we used to get questions occasionally from people who were writers of historical fiction. um, a lot of times they would want to know how much something cost, something very specific in a very specific year. And I always thought that those questions were so fun. Um, like, for example, I still remember one. Somebody wanted to know how much it would cost for a man and a horse to go across the Mississippi River in a certain year in the 1800s, because they had a character in their book who needed to do this. They needed to cross the river at St. Louis, and they wanted to know how much it would cost. And I remember I was a young librarian at the time. I was maybe been a librarian for maybe 5 years, and I thought, "This is crazy. How could we ever find this?" So I gave the question to my boss, and she's like, "Oh, I'll take a look." She went right over to the St. Louis ordinances, and she found the rate of how much it would cost if you want to take the ferry across the Mississippi River at St. Louis. And I said, "How in the world did you ever know to look in ordinances?" And she said, "Well, I've used those books before, and I happened to notice that that was in there." And I thought, my goodness, it must be really something to be a librarian who's worked in a collection for a really long time, because you would get to know it so well that when someone asked something, you'd be able to like pulling a rabbit out of your hat like that. So anyway, I always have had a great deal of love for the kind of question like that. Like, how much did something cost at a certain time? And when I was at the Historical Society for 10 years, and then I came to the University of Missouri Library in the government document section, and I began to see that there was a lot of government documents on the topic of prices and wages. And so it was in 2012 I decided to start up this website, um, to just start making note of where you could find some of this stuff. The reason why I started it in 2012 was right around that time, some of these online digital libraries had just come online, and they allowed you to link to exact pages inside of books. Now, I knew it would never work to provide a person a link to a whole book and say, "Here, the answer is somewhere in this book." Especially when people are on the internet, they don't have that kind of time or patience. But because these online digital libraries allowed you to link to exact pages, I thought the time was right to do something like this. So, knowing that most of my users would be web users who would be they'd have a limited amount of time and patience. I wanted to get them the answer as quick as they possibly could get it, with as few clicks as possible. So, I made all of my data arranged by decades, so you can pick what decade you want. I just picked the 1970s. Let me make my screen a little bigger. Okay. Oh, that was neat. Okay, so this is the way it usually looks if you're on a computer. If you are on your phone and you have a narrow screen, it actually turns into one column, which just makes this site really great for mobile users, and more than half of our users are mobile. But for those of you who are using a desktop computer, I've got it arranged so that for every decade, you've got the wages in one column and the prices in the other column. And you'll be able to just look and click on things and see how much stuff cost or how much people made. And also, to make it even more quick, I have these blue boxes at the top that help you just jump down to something very specific. So if you're looking for wages by race or by sex, you can click that, and then you'll go down to a box a little bit further down the page, and you can get women's income and earnings, or earnings by race over here. So that's pretty nice. Or by occupation, or even in foreign countries. Similarly, we've got the box that will help you find prices for any particular thing you might be interested in. And once again, these are just links that just take you further down the page, because everything here, every data link is on one page for that decade. So this is entirely the 1970s. Everything on this page is that way. So how might you want to use this site? I just want to give you an example. Whenever you are in a random conversation with somebody, or maybe you're watching a TV show, an old TV show or an old movie, and somebody mentions how much something cost in a previous time period, and maybe they make some kind of remark about how that was a lot of money, or that was, not very much money at all. Maybe they're going to compare it to today. And maybe you've been in some of these kinds of conversations. This is a site that you could very quickly, I think, whip out your phone and do a little fact checking. So I'll give you one example. This was a conversation I'd gotten in with somebody who went to the University of Missouri here in Columbia in the mid 1960s. So from 1962 to 66, sometime around then. And he said that back then college wasn't expensive. He said that if you graduated from high school and you wanted to go to college, all you had to do was work 3 months in that summer break between high school and college, and you'd have enough money for for a whole year to attend college. And I thought that was remarkable. I mean, think about that. To just work for 3 months with a high school diploma, doing some full-time job somewhere and having enough for a whole year of college. So this is how you can do your fact checking. And before I launch into this, I just want to ask, can everybody see and hear okay? And is the screen big enough? Because if you like, I can turn this back into a single column if you might see it easier that way.
It looks great, Marie. Yeah,
Okay, okay,
it sounds good and looks good.
okay, good. I also wanted to tell you guys that if you want to get my attention, I will not be looking at the chat while I'm presenting, but you can turn on your microphone and pipe up and just ask me something. Also, let me know if something's going wrong. If I don't seem to notice it, you can interrupt me for that too. So let's just do a little fact checking with that random conversation that I'd had that one time. So I'll want to go into the 1960s, and I'll want to see how much did college cost in the 60s, and how much could you make at minimum wage in the 1960s. Okay, so first of all, let's take a look at the price. We want to get the price of college. So I've got food, housing, transportation, more, cost of living. Okay, so I put a lot under more. Now here we are with this box, more prices in the United States. I have all the tabs here. So you click on education for the education tab, and we've got a few links here that tell you how much stuff costs. I'm going to just click on this one, although probably any of them will work. I'm going to click on this one. And this it goes right into a government document from the U.S. Department of Education called Digest of Education Statistics. And by the way, I wanted to let you know that this is one of the digital libraries that I link to the most. It's called HathiTrust, and it's got, oh gosh, maybe, I'm not sure if they have 20 million books yet, but close to 20 million books are in here. And the ones that are available in the public domain are available in full view. And I think gosh, I'm thinking it's somewhere around 7 million, although I might be wrong about that. I haven't checked it lately. But all federal government documents are copyright free. So I am able to freely link to all these government documents, and they'll be available for you to view. There's no copyright restrictions, so they're right there. So anyway, so when you land on a page inside HathiTrust, happens to be page 251 of this report called Digest of Education Statistics. And you just zoom in until you can see the numbers clearly. And it's showing that in 1964-65, the total amount of tuition, room, and board, if you were at a public university, university public, would have been $1,051. So that would be everything altogether, about $1,000. If you're looking at just tuition, and we're talking about in-state tuition, by the way, that would be 243. So I'm going to just quickly jot down these numbers because we're going to go and find out how much a person could make in minimum wage. 243 for tuition and about $1,000 for the whole shebang. Okay, now we're just going to back to my site, and we're going to go and see what we could make with minimum wage. So here's the federal minimum wage from 1938 up to the 2020s. And I'm going to go down until got the mid 1960s. And here we got 1964. You could Oops, what you've got 2 columns here. Oh, that was an amendment. Okay, so in 1963, the minimum wage was set at $1.25, and in 1967, it went up to $1.40. So I'm going to see how much money you could make over a summer if you made $1.25 an hour. So I've got my handy calculator out here. I'm doing $1.25 times 40 hours. So for a week's worth of work, you could make $50. Now, of course, I'm not calculating in taxes, but let's just go with this for now. In 1 week, you could make $50. That means in 1 month, you could make $200. And in 3 months, you could have $600. So was this guy right? Well, let's go back, and I'll just tell you what, we'll look once again at that uh, education tab. Oops, more prices in the United States. Cost of college, and we're going to make this big. Okay, so there's a person who was able to make $600 over the course of a summer. Well, it looks like that would have covered tuition. Tuition was just $243 for the whole year, but the whole cost of the tuition plus room and board would have been $1,000. So that person would have needed help with the room and board for sure. So it was part right. Um, and so that's one thing you can do with this site is just this basic fact checking stuff. I also wanted you to know that there is a really wonderful tool made available by the uh, Bureau of Labor Statistics, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is um, a consumer price index inflation calculator. This is a wonderful tool if ever you want to know how much a certain amount of money would have seemed like in a different year. So let's say how much would $600 seem like to us now. So if that person was able to earn $600 in, let's say, 1964, how much would that have seemed like to us in terms of the buying power? So what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does is they say has the same buying power. So let's see what that would have felt like to us. So that would have felt like earning $6,122 these days. So if you could have 600 that sorry, did I say 600? $6,122. If you had $6,000, you could look at the cost of tuition for Mizzou now and you could see how far that would get you. Well, it wouldn't get you very far. I think it would get you maybe a third of the way. But I'm not going to go into that right now. You can easily Google how much does it cost to go to any school you want to. But at least you can see that they could make $600 back at that time. It's about the same as making $6,000 now. So keep in mind that this wonderful CPI inflation calculator, because it goes all the way back to 1913. So that's a really wonderful way to compare across a very long period of time and have it be fairly economically accurate. The reason why they don't go past any earlier than 1913 is they just don't have solid data. So they can't put it in their calculator. The Bureau of Labor Statistics had not yet ramped up their data collection to the point where they had enough information that they could do a reasonable comparison between times. They also do a lot more with this CPI inflation calculator. They look at what people had to buy because obviously in 1913 people had different kinds of things they had to buy, a lot different than now, and the kinds of things that we need now they didn't have back then. So for now it's for these current days you probably need a cell phone. I mean, I don't have a smartphone, but I do have a phone that's not very smart, and I have it because I have to use it for two-factor authentication. I mean, it's get to the point now where you have to have a phone. Um, in earlier decades, in the 2010s, you didn't have to have a phone, really. I mean, you kind of did, but you could get by without one. And then the further you go back in time, the less and less phone expenses are considered, important. So that's one of the things that they take into account with the Bureau of Labor Statistics is what did people really have to buy, and then they would assign weights and stuff like that. So, so far, so good. you can use the site like that if you like. Um, Now, I'm a government information librarian, so naturally I focus on government information as much as I can with any of the links that I have on my website here. But once you go way back into the 1800s or even the 1700s, there just weren't government agencies ramped up to the point where they could collect this information in a reasonably accurate way. So for those years, I do link to other sources. For example, for prices, sometimes there's mail order catalogs that can be helpful, but especially immigrant guides. So there were these wonderful publications that were being issued, sometimes by government agencies, but sometimes by railroads. Um, or even state governments, because they wanted to attract immigration to an area. They needed more labor. There's a lot of development that needed to happen, and they needed labor to make that happen. So they wanted to attract people. So they'd make these immigrant guides and would tell how much the going rates of wages were in those places, or um, if you wanted to be a farmer, what kinds of crops grew well, and they would talk about infrastructure and things to try to attract people. So those were a great source. And then if I couldn't find materials in any other source, sometimes I would use newspapers. Let me give you an example. I'm going to go way back to this. Let's go back to the 1840s and look at prices, food, transportation, everything else. Let's go down. Um, Services, price of a haircut and a shave in New York from the 1840s. So I was able to find those in newspapers. And the reason why I tried to get haircut prices on my website is, if you think about it, what can you buy or what could you purchase as a service or as a good in the early 1800s that would pretty much be the same as now with no additional technology involved? I mean, it's really hard to think of something if you try to put your mind to that. Like, suppose you were to buy an apple. Okay, so they had apples back then, and we have apples now. But now we have all this agricultural technology. We've got mechanization, that pick apples, and we've got um, well, you know, ways to transport apples to market conveniently that they didn't have back then. So it's really, if we're trying to compare apples to apples, I know that's kind of a hackneyed expression, but it's hard even with apples. But haircuts, you'd have one person using a scissors, and it's pretty much the same now as it was then. There may still be things that are different, like how important was a good haircut to a person, back then. Is that the same then as it was now? I mean, hair fashions, I mean, probably now it's a little bit more important than it was then, although you never know about these things. They had white wigs and stuff. So, but anyway, there's still questions about it. But still, I wanted to get haircut prices in here so that it could be a thing that people could compare over time if they wanted to, and had to use newspapers. So I used this website called Chronicling America. Boy, that's a faded one. Let's use a different one. Um, Here we go. Ladies hairdressing and shampooing. This was from a New York Herald newspaper from June 11th, 1947, and it gave the rates. So that's pretty cool. I liked how when you get this far back in time, it said that the haircut cost 1 bit or 2 bits, and that's because they had coins that were like silver dollars, I think, and then if they wanted to have a part of a dollar, they would actually somehow cut that coin into pieces, and so that became bits, and those bits had value amounts of less than a dollar. So that's handy to know. So when you go way back in time, sometimes you can get into a tricky area if you're wanting to know how much something cost or how much it was worth before the United States actually had adopted the dollar. Because before the United States became a country and had its own unit of currency, the colonists were using money from Europe, and they used different monies from different countries. And so it could be very tricky to compare how much something was worth if you're talking about two different colonies. So back in my earliest decades, I make suggestions that people just do a quick read about this topic because understanding colonial currency can really help them back then. Once I got an interesting reference question about um, the sale of the island of Manhattan, like when Manhattan was purchased from the Native Americans, and it was said that it cost a certain dollar amount, and somebody asked a question about that, and I thought that was really a very interesting topic because how could it be a dollar amount like 200 years before America was even a country? And so that was really tricky. Well, I don't know if any of you are going to want to do any kind of work in colonial currencies or colonial times. But if you do, I want you to know that I'm available to assist. Although I have this website set up as a self-service website, I am still very happy to answer questions by anybody who wants some guidance because, after all, I love these kinds of questions. So, anyway, I guess I'll ask right now before I go on. Does anybody have any questions?
I have one question about the sale of the island of Manhattan.
Yes.
What did you find out?
I was fortunate enough to have a student worker who worked for me here who was majoring in economics, and I had him work on that one. Um, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to quickly just Google it. A sale of the island of Manhattan. 1626. Okay. So here we go. The amount paid was, they said it was $24 worth of beads and trinkets. Okay, I'm just going to have to click on this. Now, of course, this is the AI overview, which we all know what we think about that. It's like you have to take it with a grain of salt. But this was the legend. The amount paid for the island was disputed. It was 1626, but they said it was $24 worth of beads and trinkets. And others said it was 60 guilders. Okay, so guilders would be the amount, that would be the currency used in Holland at the time, which they say is $1,000 today. Okay, so that's really, really tricky. You're talking about 1626, you're talking about 500 years ago. Um, so what I found out was that this could all be traced back. This $24 worth of beads statement was traced back to a publication that was dated 1840s, and nobody ever updated it. Like, it kept getting quoted and requoted and requoted over and over all the way up until the 1900s, all the way up until now. I mean, because they were talking about $24 in 1840s money. Okay. But who knows how they calculated 1626 into 1840s money? This is you really have to make some big leaps. And if you talk to somebody who specializes in econ econ who is an economist, they'll be able to tell you how tricky that can be. Um, I think I want to tell you about another feature I have on my web pages. Let's just go to the 1880s. Now, I said already that I have wages in one side and prices in the other, but I have extra stuff at the bottom of each of these columns. I really wanted my site to stay pretty simple with prices and wages and not go too far afield, but I could not help myself from putting in some extra stuff that I thought people would probably really want to see. So, beyond the US wages and prices, which are the top, the next thing down would be foreign prices and wages. And then beyond that, I've got cost of living and consumer expenditures, because sometimes it's not so much how much, like, potatoes and apples and food cost. Sometimes you'd have to know how much did they have to buy of these things. So that's why I have consumer expenditures in there, because just to know how much people paid over a course of a year, if they were a family of five, how much did they spend on food? Sometimes that's the quick answer that you're really looking for. You don't want to have to figure it all out by adding up all the different prices of foods. So I did add that in, and cost of living as well. But I've also got analysis calculators and exchange rates. So if somebody's really going to dig into my site and they're really like, oh, it's really got what they want, and they're going to just kind of just explore a decade and just go to the end of this decade and see all that I've got available here, if they get down to the bottom, they get to this thing called analysis, calculators, and exchange rates. So there's this great site that won awards. It's called Measuring Worth, and it has a calculator for the present day purchasing power of a historical dollar amount. Now, I told you a few minutes ago that the BLS goes back to 1913, but this is a site that goes back further, and it is international too. They let you go back to, okay, purchasing power today of a US dollar transaction in the past. They let you go all the way back to 1790. So let's just do one. Let's just say $1 in 1790 in the year 1790. Okay, they're saying if you spent it on a purchase, it would be $35, but if it was received as wages, like compensation, it would be more like $1,600. If it was wealth, it would be $1,700. If it was a construction project. So you see, this is where the economists get involved, and they say, well, it depends on whether this was a wage or a price. Now, if you don't exactly understand what they mean by that, they do explain it all. All you got to do is just take a look at the what they're having to say about this web page. This is just one of their calculators. They also will let you go and look at calculators between different countries. Like there's Australian pounds and dollars. You could do UK pounds, relative values in the United States. And I'm not an expert on this site, but I do know that it won awards by the economic history given by the Economic History Association, which is economics professors all across the country and even in other countries. So this is a wonderful tool that you can use if ever you want to go back a little bit further than 1913. Okay, and then there's other wonderful sources here, 19th century wage trends, if you really want to know what's going on in the 1800s. Just in a nutshell, I love that particular source. And also, I want to make sure I cover a question that was included in the advertising for this session, and that was about how much would your ancestors spend on food. I have a little bit of memory from my early childhood about my grandmother, and so my grandmother was born in 1909 or something like that in St. Louis. And I kind of have a little bit of family history about that. And I can tell you that my grandmother didn't use the word refrigerator. She used the term icebox because when she was growing up, they didn't have a way to refrigerate any food in their house, and neither did their neighbors. They just didn't. Of course, they didn't have electrified appliances, way back then, in the city of St. Louis. But some people did have ice boxes, which was literally a wooden box with some ice, a block of ice in it if you wanted to keep something cool. They didn't have an ice box right away, but they eventually finally got one. And she continued to call our refrigerator the ice box, even when I was growing up in the 1970s. At any rate, what I'm getting at here is that when you lived in an urban environment and you had no way to refrigerate food, think about what it would be like, what your daily life would be like about getting food and preparing it and having meals for your family. It was all different. And one of my favorite government documents, which is a fascinating document, let me see if I can find it now. It talks about how the way of life was different as far as earning money and and shopping and just having what you needed to live in the United States over all the decades. And so it was. I'm going to see where I put this. I should have made a mental note. Um, I put it. Give me a chance. While I'm looking for this, you can just browse my site too because I've got a lot of stuff here. Here it is. How American buying habits changed. Fascinating. Publication by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And me just tell you how to navigate this stuff. So here's a picture of the front cover of this report. And if you're here in Hadi Trust, you can use these navigation um, tools over here on the side to, you could jump around in the book. You can jump to the table of contents and see what this book has to offer. It's a real nice way to work your way through this. They're talking about salaries, wages. They're talking about how housing changed. You know, what kind of living conditions did people have at these different times, and what a homemaker's job and what the home scene was like between 1900 and going up to 1950. Massive changes. Um, that, just even knowing that people would have to buy food almost every day, they couldn't go very far for that. And I'll tell you this is just a little anecdote from my own childhood. So for 1 year, my family lived with my grandmother in urban St. Louis, and in a house. Well, actually, it was a two-family flat that was built in 1911. And the way of life that we had in we're talking like around 1970, you could still see all the vestiges of the old way of life. Our whole neighborhood walked to the end of the block where there was a corner market. That's where everybody bought their food. It was literally a half a block walk to get our food. And so we didn't need a car for that. Similarly, just across the street from there was a clothes store, there was a card store, there was a bakery. We had everything we needed within a half block of walking distance, and most people in this neighborhood wouldn't have to walk more than 2 blocks or so because these little corner markets were everywhere. Even in the city of Columbia, years ago, like around the 1920 or something, we were a very small town. There was like 80 markets. I mean, a lot of markets. I looked in a city directory once and I saw how many there were. They were everywhere because people walked to them. So when you're thinking about how your ancestors purchased their groceries, it depended. There's a lot of different factors that went into that. It was way different from urban people and rural people. People in rural areas, they could produce a lot of what they needed on their farm. They could have chickens, they could have eggs, they could have gardens. They were able to produce a lot. And this is one of the reasons why when you're looking at the old data about wages that's made available by the Department of Labor, this is actually a point I really wanted to make. A lot of times the earliest data you can get from the Department of Labor is really only about urban people. And the earliest data is really focused heavily on factories. And that was because it was just logistically so much easier for them to go to the heads of factories, the leaders of factories, and say, we want a report of how much you're paying all your people. They could get a lot of data fairly quickly without having to travel a lot. You can imagine how much more difficult it would be for them, for any kind of government agency, to reach people who had little farms all over the country. You couldn't ask them very easily questions about their income. And so that's why the earliest BLS data that's really reliable goes back to 1913. That's when they got their first data programs really ramped up, and it was largely focused on urban stuff. If you look at that consumer price index, by the way, if you look into the fine print of it, um, they're going to talk about urban data collection. So, and I'm not, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on any of that, but it's just a little tip to be sure to, if you want to truly understand some of these tools that are provided, do look at the explanation because it should help you a lot. Now, I've been talking for 40 minutes, so I just want to stop and see if anybody out there has any other questions, or if you've got a particular interest in a certain period of time in our nation's history that you want to ask about. I built a whole site from the 1770s forward, and I have impressions and opinions about each of the decades with little factoids. Oh, speaking of little factoids, I've got this tab here called Quotable Facts, and this is where I've been trying to put some of the most interesting and surprising statistics. So if you wanted to go to any decade, I only have this going back to the 1890s. The quotable facts go back to the 1890s. But I think that it's really good to know some of this stuff. I discovered this when I was building the site, but I don't want people to miss some things that I think are kind of important. Like, for example, this healthcare costs averaged close to $10,000 per person in the year 2019. about 12 or 13% of which the consumer paid out of pocket. So the rest of that was being paid either by, government assistance or health insurance. Compare it to 1960, when healthcare costs averaged $124 per person for the whole year. $124 compared to $10,000 now. Back then, people did pay about half of that out of their own pocket, but still, huge, huge difference. The inflation on healthcare has risen at a much higher rate than inflation on other kinds of things. Let me tell you something that show you a link that you might enjoy. So I'm here up in a current decade, the 2010s, and I want to go down to. Oh no, I better do the 1970s. I know I have it there. Okay, in the 1970s, it was a big deal. A big deal in 1970s was inflation. That was on everybody's minds back then, and so I wanted to have a special box that talked about inflation in the 1970s because everybody wonders about that. Um, the consumer price index by category. I mentioned my student worker who was an econ major a few minutes ago. I asked him to do these links for us, and I really like them. If you go and you say you want to see the consumer price index, but just for medical care. Now, he's built it so it would go from 1970 to 1979. So you see how the price of medical care went up in that over that period of 10 years. But you could also compare that to the graph for example, gasoline over the same period of time, and it was like, whoop, it went uh, practically doubled between in just a few years. So people were really freaking out about that. But here's something else you can do. You can change the date. And if you don't want to go to 1979, if you want to see that line going all the way up to the present, then you just say, okay, I want 2024 September. And now you've got a line that goes from 1970 up to this year for gas. And this, by the way, is a super cool site. This Fred site, super cool. Once you get a line here, you can download it and you can get an image of it and you can put it into your reports. You know that you can also add a line. Like you can click on edit graph and you can add another line to it. In case you want to have two lines on that graph so you can compare two different things at once. It is really cool. I highly recommend that you take a look at this site if you are at all interested in visualizations of economic data. Brought to you by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So I'm going to stop again because I promised that I'd let you ask questions and I haven't actually given you a chance yet. Now I'm going to be quiet for a minute. Go ahead.
Thank you, Marie. I have one question. I'm
Mhm.
curious about how many hits you've had to this site. I know it's a
Oh,
very
boy.
high number, but I don't know exactly what that is.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thanks for mentioning that, Lisa. So, we get about close to 1 million hits on this site a year, uh, close to 1 million. And during these days when the school's in session like this, we get between 2,500 and 3,000 hits a day on this site. So, I also
And do you know
yes,
where they come from? Are
oh,
they all over the world?
they
People are
are.
accessing this?
They are. They're all over the world, as a matter of fact. Thank you for asking that too. It is mostly United States, but we get a lot from all of the English-speaking countries. So we get a lot from the UK and Canada, and anywhere else where they speak English. Oh, a lot from Australia, of course. We get, and then beyond that, we get other European countries. They land on it, and I think part of the reason why they're interested in it is during this period of time between the late 1800s, like really especially in the late 1800s, I have a really strong emphasis on foreign prices and wages. So you see, I haven't even told you about this yet. Foreign wages by country. So you can click on any country you want, and it kind of goes on and on. You can see how much they made in Germany in the particular area of Germany. Um, this is okay, not too much for Asia, but definitely we try to really emphasize those countries where people were immigrating to the United States from. And so people in those countries are interested in that too. And all they do is Google. If you wonder how people find the site, it's Google. They just type in how much did carpenters make in 1924 or whatever, and Google sends them to our site. So I think, what is it? ni about 90% of all of our hits are straight from Google. So,
And did you say you've had about 7 million you
yeah,
had
we're close to
hits?
7 million total.
Mhm.
It was slow ramping up. We started it in 2012, and I never advertised the site until years later because I was still building it. It obviously took a really long time to build this. And so I had it going, but I never advertised it. And it was maybe about 3 years in. Yeah, it was around 3 years in. I decided to just look to see what the statistics were on it, the hits. And I was astounded at how many people were looking at my site. I thought, oh, it's not ready. Oh my gosh, my site isn't ready for people to look at. It was almost embarrassing, to be branded with our library's name and for it to be I didn't think ready for prime time. So I quickly started adding more in and trying to get at least some really significant gaps filled. And the more I added in, the more those hits just skyrocketed. So we are, like I said, we're up to close to 1 million annually now, and I think it might probably stay that way. One of the things why I think, if you were to just Google and look for like the price of saltine crackers in 1954 or something like that, you'll probably find some other websites out there where people have gone and found some old newspaper and found a sales section. Here's the prices of our crackers and everything. I think one thing that distinguishes our site from exclusive loose use of newspapers is the fact that we really do try to use those government sources as much as possible. This is an example. This is a photograph of a U.S. government agency agent in a grocery store, carefully writing down the prices of all these jars of jelly or pickle relish or whatever it is. And they had people going around to grocery stores all around the country because they wanted to make sure they had a good sample. If they're going to say, what's the average cost of food, they needed to have a system for data collection that would be so rock solid that a person could rely on it over time. And so they stuck with their really excellent data collection methods so that you can rely on their data. It's a lot different. If you really want to know how much, like for example, food prices, relying on a Bureau of Labor Statistics data is going to be so much better than any random newspaper article. Now, I do know that I told you a few minutes ago that I did use newspaper articles for some kind of data, but that's when I absolutely couldn't find any other source for it. And speaking of, I told you that I used the newspapers for haircuts. Believe it or not, the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually did collect the cost of haircuts in the 1950s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Where are they? Um, it's somewhere in here. Health and medicine, education, communication. That's a big one. I'm I'm going to get off the haircut thing for a minute because I know it's in here. But I was just noticing this guy on the payphone. Um, I imagine if any of you as a student in this class or is a student who's present right now, you might have heard some older person in your family or some member of an older generation talk to you about the cost of a long distance phone call. I think that for people who are elderly now, like that's one of the biggest surprises is just that long distance used to be so terribly expensive. When I was in college, we didn't use long distance. It was considered ridiculously expensive. Everybody wrote letters. So that's one of the most dramatic changes I think over time is the cost of communication. It used to be really hard, and now that's one of those things that's really easy. So, any
So
other
are there
questions?
any other questions from anyone who's joined us? Are you curious about anything? You want an expert government information reference librarian to help you answer? Do you have somewhere you grew up and you want to know how much eggs were? Well, Marie, I don't see any questions in the chat, and I don't see anyone asking any
All
questions.
right. Well,
Uh,
I'll turn on my tile then to say
okay.
hello again.
Okay, let me stop the recording.
Okay,
One moment.
I need to stop